Chapter 15. The Cardinal's War. Cardinal Joseph Fesch had served the Church for over 40 years, had navigated the treacherous political waters of revolutionary France, and had witnessed the rise of his nephew Napoleon from provincial artillery officer to Emperor of Europe. But nothing in his extensive experience had prepared him for the war he now found himself leading, a battle not for territory or political power, but for the very souls of his people. Standing before the altar in the ancient underground cathedral, surrounded by the extraordinary gathering of marked faithful, he felt the weight of responsibility pressing down upon him like a physical burden. These people, these humble servants and shopkeepers who bore the stigmata of willing sacrifice, to look to him for leadership in a conflict that transcended anything in his theological training. The candlelight flickered across faces that glowed with inner radiance, each person present bearing some mark of divine calling. But Cardinal Fesch was acutely aware that time was running short. 18 days until the Feast of St. Bartholomew. 18 days to cleanse Paris of shadow corruption, to save whatever souls could still be saved. And somehow, to reach the man Napoleon had been before the darkness claimed him. "My friends," he began, his voice carrying the authority of decades spent addressing congregations both humble and grand, "we stand at a crossroads not just of history, but of eternity itself. The enemy we face is not human, not political, not bound by the ordinary rules of warfare. It is spiritual corruption in its purest form, the negation of everything that makes existence meaningful." A young woman near the front of the gathering raised her hand. Cardinal Fesch recognized her as Marguerite Leclerc, a seamstress from the Marais district, whose palms bore scars that glowed like captured starlight. "Your Eminence," she said, her voice clear and strong despite her humble origins, "I have seen the shadow, touched in my neighborhood. They are my neighbors, people I have known for years. But when I try to speak to them of faith, of hope, they look at me with eyes that are empty. How do we reach souls that seem to have forgotten what souls are for?" Cardinal Fesch nodded gravely. It was the central question that had been troubling him since this crisis began. "Sister Marguerite, you have identified the core of our challenge. The shadow does not simply corrupt, it empties. It drains away the capacity for independent thought, for genuine emotion, for the kind of love that requires sacrifice. What we face are not evil people, but people who have been systematically stripped of their humanity." He moved to a side chapel, where several reliquaries were displayed, each one glowing with its own inner light. As he approached, the objects seemed to respond to his presence, their radiance growing brighter. "Brother Francois," he called to the Franciscan monk, "tell us again what you discovered about the blessed object's effects on the shadow touched." The monk stepped forward, carrying the reliquary containing St. Denis's fingerbone. "Your Eminence, the results are both encouraging and deeply troubling. Against those who have been fully transformed, the walking dead who no longer retain any trace of their human nature, the holy relics are absolutely effective. They can destroy such creatures entirely, sending whatever remains of their souls to divine judgment." He paused, his face growing grave. "But with the living infected, those who still breathe, still walk among us, but whose souls have been partially consumed by shadow, the blessed objects produce a different effect. They cause the shadow to recoil, yes, but they also cause tremendous pain to the human host. The darkness clings to them so tightly that removing it feels like tearing away part of their essential being." Captain Moreau, his uniform bearing new insignia that seemed to glow with their own light, spoke up from where he stood with a group of soldiers who had chosen faith over empire. "I have witnessed this firsthand, Your Eminence. A blessed medal pressed against the forehead of a shadow-touched baker in the Saint-Antoine district caused him to scream for nearly an hour. Not screams of rage or defiance, but of genuine agony, as if we were torturing an innocent man. Cardinal Fesch felt his heart heavy with the implications, and yet we cannot simply leave them in their corrupted state. Each soul that remains claimed by darkness will serve as a conduit for the Emperor's ritual. If we do not find a way to cleanse them, their spiritual energy will be used to tear open permanent doorways between our world and the void that spawns such evil. Marie Claire stepped forward from where she had been in quiet conversation with the Empress. Her scars were glowing more brightly than usual, and her expression carried the weight of recent revelation. "Your Eminence," she said, her voice carrying an authority that transcended her humble origins. "There is another way, but it requires a sacrifice that goes beyond what we have asked of anyone so far." The entire cathedral fell silent, all attention focused on the woman who had revealed herself to be far more than a simple servant. "I have been shown," Marie Claire continued, "that the shadow can indeed be drawn out of living hosts without destroying them. But it cannot simply be banished. Spiritual energy, like physical energy, can neither be created nor destroyed, only transformed. The darkness that has infected them must go somewhere." Cardinal Fesch felt a chill that had nothing to do with the underground chamber's temperature. "You mean—" "I mean that someone must be willing to take that darkness into themselves, to bear the spiritual burden of the shadow touched, to absorb their corruption and transform it through perfect faith." Her scarred arm blazed like a torch in the candlelight. "It is possible, I have seen it done, but the cost is severe." Brother Francois leaned forward intently. "What cost?" Marie Claire's smile was radiant and terrible at the same time. "The person who undertakes such a cleansing must be prepared to experience every moment of despair, every flash of rage, every instant of spiritual agony that drove their subjects to embrace the shadow in the first place. They must feel the full weight of that accumulated darkness, hold it within their own soul, and through their faith transform it into light." The implications hit the gathered faithful like a physical blow. Several people gasped audibly, and Cardinal Fesch saw more than one face go pale with understanding. "You're describing a form of spiritual martyrdom," he said quietly. "I am describing the ultimate imitation of Christ," Marie Claire replied, her voice unwavering. "The willing acceptance of others' sins and suffering, with faith that divine grace will transform what is evil into what is holy." General Junot stepped forward, the fresh scars on his forehead pulsing with their own rhythm. How many could be saved this way, and how many purifiers would be required? Marie Claire closed her eyes, and for a moment her face took on an expression of profound concentration, as if she were consulting some inner source of knowledge. "The shadow has claimed approximately 30,000 souls in Paris," she said when she opened her eyes again. "Most are in the early stages of infection, their humanity diminished, but not yet completely destroyed. Perhaps 1,000 have been transformed beyond redemption and must be handled with blessed weapons." She paused, clearly calculating spiritual mathematics that transcended ordinary understanding. To cleanse the savable ones would require approximately 300 willing purifiers, people prepared to take the accumulated darkness of 100 souls each into themselves and transform it through faith. The cathedral erupted in murmurs of concern and debate. The numbers were staggering, the implications almost beyond comprehension. 300 souls sacrificed to save 30,000, Captain Moreau said grimly. And those 300, what happens to them? They become something new, Marie-Claire replied simply. Neither wholly human nor wholly divine, but bridges between the two realms. They carry the transformed darkness within themselves forever. But that darkness, purified by their sacrifice, becomes a source of light for others. Cardinal Fesch found himself thinking of the martyrs of old, the saints who had willingly endured torture and death rather than renounce their faith. But this was something different, not just the surrender of mortal life, but the willing acceptance of spiritual burden that would last beyond death itself. And if we cannot find 300 willing to make such a sacrifice, then Napoleon's ritual succeeds, Marie-Claire said starkly. The shadow gains enough collective spiritual energy to permanently establish itself in our world, and what begins in Paris will eventually consume all of Europe, then all of the world. A new voice spoke from the crowd, an elderly woman whose grey hair seemed to glow with its own inner light. Cardinal Fesch recognized her as Mother Superior Catherine from the Convent of the Sacred Heart, whose nuns had been among the first to report encounters with the shadow-touched. "Your Eminence," Mother Catherine said, her voice clear and strong despite her age. "I volunteer to be among the 300. My sisters and I have discussed this, and we are prepared to offer ourselves for the salvation of our city." Her words seemed to break a dam of hesitation. Voices began rising throughout the cathedral. "I will serve. Count me among them. For the love of God and France, I volunteer." Within minutes, nearly half the people present, over 200 souls, had offered themselves for the ultimate sacrifice. Cardinal Fesch felt tears streaming down his face as he witnessed this extraordinary display of selfless love. But even as his heart swelled with pride and gratitude, his practical mind was calculating. 200 volunteers, perhaps 50 more who could be found among the faithful in other parts of Paris. They were still short of the number required. "My friends," he called out, raising his hands for quiet. "Your courage humbles me, but we need more volunteers, and we need them quickly. The ritual must be completed before the Emperor begins his own working on St. Bartholomew's feast." Brother Francois stepped forward, clutching his glowing reliquary. "Your Eminence, what of the other cities? Lyon, Marseille, Rouen. Surely there are faithful there who would answer this call?" "I have already dispatched messengers," Cardinal Fesch replied. "But travel takes time, and we cannot be certain they will arrive before we must act." It was then that the Empress, who had been quietly observing the proceedings, stepped forward. The ancient crucifix in her hands blazed like a star, and when she spoke, her voice carried an authority that transcended her political position. "I will be one of the 300, Josephine declared, and the entire cathedral fell into shocked silence. Cardinal Fesch stared at her in amazement. "Madame, you cannot— The implications are precisely why I must," she interrupted, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Napoleon is my husband, and the corruption that has claimed him began with his desire to protect what we had built together. If anyone should bear the burden of cleansing that corruption, it should be me." Marie-Claire moved to her side, her expression both proud and sorrowful. "Madame, you understand what you are offering? The spiritual agony you would endure would include not just the darkness of strangers, but the accumulated weight of your husband's own corruption, every choice he has made that led him further from the light." "I understand," Josephine replied firmly, "and I accept it willingly, with full knowledge of the cost." The cathedral began to fill with a different kind of light, not the warm radiance of the candles and relics, but something harder, more intense, like sunlight concentrated through a lens. Cardinal Fesch realized he was witnessing something unprecedented in church history: the spontaneous canonization of living saints through their willing acceptance of ultimate sacrifice. "Very well," he said, his voice carrying the full authority of his office. "Let it be recorded that on this day, in this place, 300 souls offered themselves for the salvation of their city and their fellow human beings. Let history remember not their names, but their choice to love so completely that they were willing to bear the sins of others and transform them through faith." He moved to the altar and picked up a large book bound in white leather, the Chronicle of Martyrs, that had been maintained in this sanctuary for over 1,000 years. As he opened it to a fresh page, golden light streamed from its blank surface. "We will begin at dawn," he announced, dipping a quill in ink that seemed to glow with its own inner fire. "Teams of 3 will move through the infected districts. One to identify and contain the shadow, touched, one to perform the cleansing ritual, and one to provide spiritual support and protection." As he began writing the names of volunteers in the sacred book, each letter seemed to burn itself into the parchment with permanent fire. But even as he wrote, Cardinal Fesch found his thoughts turning to the greater challenge that lay ahead. Even if they succeeded in cleansing 30,000 souls, even if they prevented Napoleon's ritual from reaching its full power, they still faced the fundamental problem: the emperor himself, the source of the shadow's influence in France, the man who had willingly opened doorways that should never have been opened, who had traded his humanity for power that no mortal was meant to possess. "Marie Claire," he called to the enigmatic woman, who seemed to understand so much more than the rest of them. "Assuming our purification succeeds, assuming we can cleanse the shadow touched before St. Bartholomew's feast, what then? How do we reach Napoleon himself?" Her expression grew troubled, and for the first time since he had known her, she seemed genuinely uncertain. "That, Your Eminence, is the one part of this battle that cannot be planned or predicted. The Emperor's choice between the shadow he has embraced and the light that still calls to him must be made freely. We can create the conditions for that choice. We can remove the corrupting influence of the masses he has infected, but we cannot make the choice for him." She looked directly at Josephine, her eyes filled with compassion and sorrow. "In the end, it will come down to a single moment of decision: darkness or light, power or love, the thing he has become or the man he once was. And that moment will test not just his soul, but the soul of everyone who truly loves him." The cathedral fell silent as the implications settled over them. They were preparing for war, not just against supernatural forces, but against the corruption of love itself, the perversion of everything noble into something monstrous. Cardinal Fesch finished writing the last name in the Chronicle of Martyrs and closed the book. As he did so, a sound echoed through the cathedral, distant at first, but growing stronger. It was singing, but not the harmonious hymns they had been hearing. This was the terrible unison chanting of the shadow touched, and it was coming from directly above them. "They know we are here," Captain Moreau said grimly, his hand moving instinctively to his blessed sword. Marie Claire's scars blazed brighter, and she tilted her head as if listening to voices only she could hear. "No," she said quietly. "They do not know our location, but the Emperor does. He can sense the gathering of so much concentrated light, and he is displeased." As if summoned by her words, a new sound joined the chanting above, Napoleon's voice, carrying supernatural resonance that made the stone walls of the cathedral vibrate. "Josephine," the voice called, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere. "My dear wife, hiding in the depths like a frightened rabbit. Come out, and let us discuss this situation like civilized people." The Empress gripped her crucifix tighter, but her voice remained steady. "He cannot enter here while we maintain our circle of faith?" "Not directly," Marie-Claire confirmed. "But his influence grows stronger each day. Soon, very soon, we must take the battle to him." Cardinal Fesch looked around at the 300 souls who had volunteered for the ultimate sacrifice, at the faithful who had gathered from across Paris to stand against the darkness, and felt something he had not experienced in all his years of service to the Church. The presence of the divine, not as distant mystery, but as immediate, tangible power. "Then let us begin," he declared, his voice ringing with new authority. "Let us show the Emperor what true power looks like, not the dominion that comes from fear and compulsion, but the infinitely greater strength that flows from love, willing to sacrifice everything for the good of others." The battle for Napoleon's soul, and for the soul of France itself, was about to begin. Chapter 16. The purification begins. Dawn broke grey and cold over Paris on the morning that would later be remembered as the Day of Cleansing. Brother Francois stood at the edge of the Faubourg Saint-Antoine, the eastern district where the shadow's corruption ran deepest, clutching the reliquary of Saint-Denis with hands that trembled not from fear, but from the overwhelming presence of the divine that had settled upon him during the night's prayers. Behind him, teams of the faithful spread out through the narrow streets, each group of 3, carrying blessed objects that glowed like captured starlight in the dim morning light. The air itself seemed different here, thicker somehow, tainted with whispers that spoke in languages that predated human civilization. But against that ancient malevolence, the voices of the purifiers rose in harmonious prayer, their words weaving a net of light that held the darkness at bay. "Remember," Brother Francois called to the nearest teams, his voice carrying clearly through the supernatural stillness. "We are not here to destroy, but to heal. Every soul we encounter was once someone's child, someone's beloved. The darkness has stolen their humanity, but the divine spark still burns within them. We need only fan that spark back into flame." Sister Marguerite, the seamstress whose palms bore scars like stars, nodded grimly as she shouldered a pack filled with blessed oils and sacred waters. "Brother, I know these people. Madame Theroux, who sold bread on the corner, she was kind to my children when they were hungry. Pierre the blacksmith, he shoed my donkey for free when times were hard. To see them now, with those empty eyes, which is precisely why we must succeed," Brother Francois replied, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "The love you bear for them, the memories of who they were, that is our greatest weapon against the void that has consumed them." As they moved deeper into the infected district, the signs of corruption became more apparent. Windows that should have been bright with morning sun instead reflected only darkness. Flowers in window boxes had withered to black husks overnight. Even the very stones of the buildings seemed to have absorbed some taint, their surfaces bearing stains that shifted and moved when observed directly. But most disturbing of all were the people themselves. They moved through the streets in perfect synchronization, their faces blank and serene, their eyes reflecting no light. Children played games that involved no laughter, their movements precise and joyless. Merchants opened their stalls and arranged their wares with mechanical efficiency. But when they spoke to customers, their voices carried the same hollow resonance that had begun to characterize the emperor's speech. "There," whispered Father Dubois, a young priest whose forehead bore a crown of glowing scars. The baker's shop. 3 souls inside, a man, woman, and child. They retain enough humanity to be saved, but the shadow clings to them like tar. Brother Francois nodded and approached the shop with careful, reverent steps. Through the window, he could see the family working in unnatural silence, the baker kneading dough with movements too regular to be human, his wife arranging loaves with geometric precision, their young son sweeping the floor in patterns that hurt the eyes to follow. In the name of Christ who conquered death, Brother Francois began, his voice carrying the authority of absolute faith. I call upon the light that dwells in every human heart to remember itself. He raised the reliquary, and immediately the golden casket blazed with radiance that seemed to penetrate the very walls of the building. Inside the shop, the 3 figures stopped their mechanical movements and turned toward him with expressions of sudden confusion, as if they were waking from a deep and troubled sleep. But with that awakening came agony. The baker clutched his head and screamed, not the hollow sound that had characterized the shadow touched, but genuine human anguish. His wife collapsed to her knees, weeping tears that steamed as they hit the flour-dusted floor. The child ran to the corner and huddled there, his small body racked with sobs that spoke of a soul remembering what it had lost. Hold fast, Brother Francois called to his companions as they prepared for the most difficult part of their task. The darkness fights hardest when it knows it is losing. Sister Marguerite stepped forward, her scarred palms beginning to glow with their own inner fire. I will take the woman, she said quietly. Her pain, I recognize it. The fear of losing everything you love, I have felt that darkness myself. Without hesitation, she placed her hands on the baker's wife and immediately began to scream herself as the shadow corruption flowed from the infected woman into her own soul. But even as the darkness entered her, Sister Marguerite's faith transformed it, her love for her neighbor burning away the void and leaving behind something purified, sacred. Father Dubois moved to the child, gathering the sobbing boy into his arms. I understand your fear, little one, he whispered, as his own scars blazed brighter. I too was afraid of the dark when I was your age, but see how the light chases all shadows away? The spiritual poison flowed from child to priest, and Father Dubois gasped as he felt the weight of innocence corrupted, of trust betrayed, of hope systematically destroyed. But his own willing sacrifice transformed that darkness, his faith in divine goodness burning away the despair and leaving the child's soul clean and bright. Brother Francois approached the baker himself, a big man whose face bore the lines of someone who had worked with his hands all his life, who had taken pride in feeding his neighbors, whose corruption was perhaps the deepest because it had perverted his natural desire to serve others. My friend, Brother Francois said gently, placing one hand on the baker's shoulder while raising the reliquary with the other. You have been far from home, but the way back is still open to you. The baker looked at him with eyes that flickered between empty darkness and desperate humanity. I remember you, brother. You used to buy bread here on Sundays after morning mass. But that was I dreaming? Did any of that really happen? It all happened, Brother Francois assured him. And it can happen again. But first, you must let me help you remember who you really are. He pressed the reliquary against the baker's forehead, and both men cried out as the full weight of the shadow's corruption flowed between them. Brother Francois felt himself drowning in despair so profound it seemed to stop his heart, the accumulated anguish of a man who had watched his life's work perverted into an instrument of spiritual poison, who had been forced to feed corruption to the very neighbors he loved. But faith, Brother Francois had learned, was stronger than any darkness. His love for this man, his absolute trust in divine mercy, his willingness to bear any burden for the sake of another's salvation, these burned through the shadow corruption like fire through chaff, transforming curse into blessing, despair into hope. When the transfer was complete, the baker collapsed to his knees, weeping tears of genuine emotion for the first time in weeks. His wife and child ran to him, and they embraced with the desperate joy of a family reunited after thinking they had lost each other forever. But the three purifiers who had saved them now bore scars that would last beyond death itself, marks that glowed with transformed darkness, badges of willing sacrifice that identified them as something new in the long history of sanctity. "One family saved," Sister Marguerite whispered, her voice hoarse from screaming but filled with quiet triumph. 29,997 souls to go. Brother Francois looked at his companions, good people who had willingly damned themselves to save others, and felt his heart break with love for them, even as it soared with hope for the city they were fighting to reclaim. "Then we continue," he said simply, and led them deeper into the shadow, touched district. By midday, 17 families had been cleansed, their souls restored to the light through the willing sacrifice of 51 purifiers. But each cleansing took longer than the last, and the toll on those performing the ritual was becoming increasingly apparent. Several purifiers had collapsed from spiritual exhaustion, their bodies unable to process the amount of concentrated evil they had absorbed. Others bore new scars that pulsed with darker light than before, signs that they were approaching the limit of how much transformed darkness a human soul could contain. And throughout it all, the shadow fought back with increasing desperation. Windows exploded outward as the teams approached infected buildings. The very stones of the street cracked and shifted, trying to trip the purifiers. Whispers in dead languages grew so loud they threatened to drown out the prayers of the faithful. And twice, Brother Francois had to use his reliquary to destroy shadow constructs, things that had once been human but had been so completely consumed by darkness that no spark of the divine remained in them. It was as they approached the central square of the district that they encountered their greatest challenge yet. The square was filled with shadow-touched citizens, perhaps 300 souls standing in perfect formation, their voices raised in that terrible unison, chanting that made the air itself seem to writhe with malevolent purpose. At their center stood a figure that Brother Francois recognized with a chill of terror. Marshal Ney, one of Napoleon's most trusted commanders, but transformed into something that barely resembled humanity. The marshal's uniform had been replaced by robes that seemed to be cut from shadow itself, and his face bore markings that shifted and changed, like living tattoos. When he spoke, his voice carried harmonics that no human throat should produce. "So," Marshal Ney said, his words causing frost to form on the windows of surrounding buildings, "the mice emerge from their holes to challenge the inevitable. How quaint." Brother Francois stepped forward, his reliquary blazing with light that held the shadow chorus at bay. "Michel Ney," he called, using the marshal's given name deliberately. "I knew you when you were a man of honor. That man still exists somewhere within the shell you have become. I call upon him to remember his oath to France, to his soldiers, to the ideals that once moved him to greatness." The thing that had been Ney laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "That man was weak, mortal, limited by conscience and sentiment. I have been freed from such chains. I serve a master now who offers true immortality, true power, power over death itself." "You serve nothing," Brother Francois replied firmly. "You have been consumed by nothing, transformed into nothing, promised nothing. The void you worship creates nothing, builds nothing, loves nothing. It is the enemy of existence itself. As he spoke, he began walking forward into the square, his reliquary held high. The shadow-touched citizens turned toward him with movements too synchronized to be natural, their empty eyes reflecting the sacred light like black mirrors. And yet, Marshal Ney countered, gesturing to the assembled masses, see how willingly they serve. No coercion, no chains, simply the recognition that they are part of something greater than their individual selves. Can your light offer them anything comparable? Yes, said a new voice from behind Brother Francois. It can offer them love. He turned to see Sister Marguerite approaching, but she had been transformed by her morning's work. The scars on her palms now blazed like stars, and her simple dress seemed to glow with its own inner radiance. Behind her came Father Dubois and the other purifiers who had been cleansing the district. 51 souls who bore the marks of willing sacrifice, who had taken darkness into themselves and transformed it through faith. We offer them something your master cannot provide, Sister Marguerite continued, addressing the corrupted marshal directly. We offer them the chance to be truly seen, truly known, truly valued, not as identical servants of a vast machine, but as unique individuals loved beyond measure. She stepped toward the nearest shadow-touched citizen, a young mother whose child clung to her skirts with movements too precise to be natural affection. Marie, Sister Marguerite said gently, recognizing her neighbor. Marie, do you remember when your little Pierre took his first steps? How you laughed and cried at the same time? How you said it was the most beautiful sound in the world when he called you Mama? For a moment, something flickered in the woman's eyes. A spark of memory, of genuine emotion, but Marshal Ney's voice cut through the air like a blade. Silence, vessel. You serve a greater purpose now than mere individual sentiment. The spark died, and the woman's face returned to its blank serenity. But Brother Francois had seen enough to know that the human soul was still there, still reachable. You are wrong, Marshal, he said, beginning to walk in a slow circle around the assembled crowd. You speak of purpose, but what you offer is meaninglessness. You speak of immortality, but what you provide is spiritual death. You speak of freedom, but you have created the ultimate slavery, the slavery of souls that no longer remember they were meant to be free. As he walked, the light from his reliquary began to affect the shadow-touched citizens. Not the violent reaction they had seen in individual cleansings, but something subtler, a stirring, a restlessness, as if they were beginning to remember what they had lost. Look at them, Brother Francois continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. 300 souls, and yet they speak with one voice, think with one mind, dream with one dream. They have been made identical, interchangeable, empty. Is this the gift your master offers? Is this the evolution he promises? The marshal's face contorted with rage, and suddenly the temperature in the square plummeted. Frost began forming on the cobblestones, and the shadow-touched citizens swayed like wheat in a wind that carried whispers in languages that predated human speech. Enough, Marshal Ney roared, and his voice shattered windows throughout the district. You speak of love, but love is weakness. You speak of freedom, but freedom is chaos. We offer order, permanence, the end of suffering through the end of individual will. You offer nothing, Sister Marguerite replied, stepping forward with her scarred palms blazing. And we are here to prove it. What happened next would be remembered in the chronicles of the Church as the miracle of the square. Without signal or coordination, all 51 purifiers stepped forward simultaneously, surrounding the 300 shadow-touched citizens in a circle of living light. "We call upon each of you by name," they said in perfect unison, their voices harmonizing in ways that seemed to bypass the ears and speak directly to the soul. Marie Dubois, mother of Pierre; Jacques Moreau, carpenter and dreamer; Claudette Rousseau, who sang in the church choir; Henri Blanc, who gave bread to the hungry. As each name was spoken, the corresponding citizen began to stir, to remember, to reclaim fragments of individual identity that the shadow had tried to erase. The perfect synchronization of their movements began to break down as 300 souls started to remember what it meant to be human. Marshal Ney screamed, not in rage now, but in genuine terror as he realized what was happening. "No, you cannot. They belong to the darkness now. They have chosen." They chose despair when hope seemed impossible. Brother Francois replied, his reliquary now blazing so brightly it seemed to contain a fragment of the sun itself. They chose emptiness when meaning seemed elusive, but they did not choose to stop being human. That choice was taken from them through deception. He raised the reliquary high above his head, and suddenly every blessed object carried by the purifiers responded, creating a network of light that connected all 51 souls into a single radiant mandala. "We offer them a different choice," the purifiers said in unison, their combined faith creating harmonics that made the air itself sing. "We offer to take their darkness into ourselves, to bear their burdens, to transform their pain into something sacred through our willing sacrifice." What followed was, unlike any of the individual cleansings they had performed, instead of the shadow corruption flowing from one person to another, it seemed to lift from all 300 citizens simultaneously, rising like black smoke into the air above the square. But instead of dissipating, the darkness swirled and coalesced, drawn by the combined will of the 51 purifiers into their own souls. The spiritual agony was indescribable. Brother Francois felt himself drowning in 3 centuries' worth of accumulated despair. Every moment of hopelessness, every instant of betrayal, every second of soul-crushing emptiness that had driven these people to embrace the void. But alongside that darkness came the faith of 50 others, their combined love creating a furnace hot enough to transform curse into blessing. When it was over, 300 souls stood free in the square, weeping with joy as they remembered who they were. And 51 purifiers bore new scars, marks that glowed with light so transformed it seemed to contain hints of colors that had no names. But Marshal Ney had not been cleansed. The thing that had consumed him was too deeply rooted, too fundamentally changed to be reached by any earthly intervention. "This is not over," he snarled, his form already beginning to dissolve into shadow. "The Emperor's ritual approaches. You have saved a few hundred souls, but there are thousands more, and time grows short." He gestured, and suddenly the purifiers could see, as if through supernatural sight, the true scope of the challenge they faced. Throughout Paris, shadow-touched citizens moved in vast coordinated patterns, their combined spiritual energy forming geometric shapes that connected to form a city-wide sigil of unimaginable complexity. 18 more days, Marshal Ney continued, his voice fading as his physical form dispersed. 18 days until the feast of Saint Bartholomew, when every cleansed soul you have saved will be reclaimed, when every act of purification will be reversed, when the shadow claims not just Paris, but all of creation. He was gone, leaving behind only frost-covered cobblestones and the echo of terrible laughter. But the 300 freed souls surrounded the 51 purifiers, with expressions of gratitude so pure it seemed to warm the air itself. "What now, brother?" Sister Marguerite asked, her voice hoarse from the spiritual ordeal, but still strong with purpose. Brother Francois looked around at the faces, both the saved and the savers, and felt something stir in his heart that transcended hope, transcended faith, transcended even love itself. "Now," he said, "we prove that Marshal Ney was wrong about one thing. We prove that time is not our enemy, but our ally. We have 17 days to save 30,000 souls, and we will save them all." He raised his reliquary once more, and its light seemed to reach beyond the square, beyond the district, beyond the physical realm itself. A beacon calling every soul in Paris who still remembered what it meant to love something greater than themselves. "The real battle," he added quietly, "is just beginning."